Have you ever stood in a room full of noise? Conversations bouncing from every corner, words flowing like rivers, some gentle, others sharp. And yet, in the middle of it all, someone sits silently, not speaking, not reacting, simply present. And somehow, that silence speaks louder than anything else in the room. We live in an age of endless chatter. Words flood our screens, our feeds, our minds. We're encouraged to share, to comment, to argue, to declare our opinions at every turn. It feels as if silence has become a forgotten art, a lost virtue. But those who truly understand life, those who have glimpsed its deeper layers, they speak less. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they realize the immense weight every word carries. In ancient wisdom, particularly within Buddhist philosophy, words are not just sounds. They're seeds. Every word you plant has the power to blossom into peace or conflict, into healing or harm. The Buddha taught that our speech, our actions, and our thoughts are the three doors through which karma enters and leaves. And of these, speech is often the most underestimated. A single word can heal a heart or break it. A single sentence can spark a war or bring nations together. And yet, how carelessly we throw them around. There's an old Zen story. A young disciple once asked his master, "Master, why do you speak so little?" The old monk smiled gently and pointed to a bell hanging nearby. When someone strikes the bell, he said, it rings. But if it's struck too often, even the sweetest sound becomes noise. The disciple understood. Silence is not emptiness. It's space. And in that space, truth echoes louder. The wise know this. They've seen how words once spoken can never be taken back. They've witnessed how speech can trap a person in cycles of pride, anger, and misunderstanding. And so they speak only when necessary, when words can uplift, enlighten, or ease suffering. Not because they're timid, not because they fear judgment, but because they respect the power of language. In the Dhammapada, one of Buddhism's oldest texts, it is written, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." That is the heart of this wisdom, not quantity, not cleverness, but meaning. There's another story of a wandering monk who arrived at a crowded village. People gathered around him, eager to hear him speak. But the monk simply sat beneath a tree, closed his eyes, and remained silent. Hours passed. The villagers grew restless. Some mocked him. "What kind of holy man is this? He says nothing." But an old woman, wise with years, watched quietly. After a while, she approached the monk and bowed deeply. "Your silence teaches louder than their noise," she said. "In your stillness, I've seen the reflection of my own restless mind. You see, it isn't about the number of words we speak. It's about their source. When we speak to impress, to be heard, to feed our ego, our words become heavy burdens. They stir up attachment, pride, and endless desire for validation. But when words arise from stillness, from wisdom, from compassion, even a single phrase can carry the weight of a lifetime's teaching. That's why the Buddha, when asked certain questions about the nature of the universe, the beginning of time, the afterlife, sometimes chose silence, not because he didn't know, but because he understood that not all questions lead to freedom. Some are mere distractions of the restless mind. There's profound power in what remains unsaid. Modern life, however, teaches the opposite. We're conditioned to fill every silence, to defend every opinion, to explain, justify, and proclaim ourselves. But what if we did? What if, for once, we allowed silence to settle, to reveal what words so often conceal? It's in silence that truths rise to the surface. It's in silence that we hear the trembling of our own heart. And it's in silence that wisdom matures. Because the wise do not fear the quiet. They know it's where the soul breathes. So perhaps, the next time you're tempted to speak, to fill the air, to win a conversation, or to showcase your knowledge, pause. Ask yourself, Will these words lighten another's burden or add to their weight? In that moment of pause, you'll glimpse the wisdom the ancients spoke of. Silence isn't a void, it's a canvas, and on it the wisest paint their truths not with noise but with presence. Have you ever wondered why people talk so much? Why conversations, both online and off, seem endless? Why everyone feels the need to comment, explain, argue, and narrate every tiny fragment of their day? It isn't just habit. It's hunger. A hunger not of the body, but of the mind. A hunger for attention, for validation, for significance. And like any craving, the more it's fed, the louder it grows. In the ancient Buddhist texts, there's a term, papanika, meaning mental proliferation. It describes the way our minds endlessly fabricate stories, judgments, opinions, and fantasies. And most of these, we impulsively turn into words. The world today is louder than it has ever been. Not because there's more wisdom to share, but because there's more insecurity to hide. Most people speak too much not to express truth, but to mask emptiness. Think about it. How often do people speak just to fill silence, to avoid discomfort, to assert control over a space? We tell jokes we don't believe in, offer opinions we haven't deeply considered, and echo ideas we barely understand, all because stillness feels unbearable. But why does silence make us so uneasy? Because in silence, we meet ourselves, and most are not ready for that meeting. In the noise of conversation, the endless chatter of social media, and the constant stream of entertainment, we avoid the raw truth of our own minds. That uncomfortable awareness of our fears, our regrets, our loneliness. So we keep talking. We narrate our lives on platforms, explain our choices to strangers, debate trivial matters to feel important. And each word we release becomes like a stone thrown into a still pond, disturbing the calm waters of both our own minds and those around us. But the wise, those who have touched the deeper current of life, they see this clearly. They see how speech often serves as a shield, a defense mechanism protecting the fragile ego from its own reflection. There's a Zen story of a young man who sought out a revered monk, desperate for guidance. He arrived at the temple and without pause began pouring out his troubles. "Master, I am lost," he said. "People misunderstand me. I'm anxious. I have too many worries." The monk listened silently. And when the young man finally stopped to catch his breath, the monk pointed to a nearby stream. "Look at the water," he said. "When disturbed, it cannot reflect the moon. Only when it's still does its surface reveal what lies above." The message was clear. As long as the mind is filled with noise and the mouth is endlessly speaking, clarity remains out of reach. But society doesn't teach us this. Instead, it rewards loudness. It glorifies those who dominate conversations, who speak fastest, shout the loudest, and leave no room for quiet. In modern culture, silence is mistaken for weakness. A person who doesn't rush to voice an opinion is labeled indifferent, or worse, ignorant. But in truth, those who can hold their tongue possess a rare strength. They are not controlled by the compulsive need to be seen or heard. They understand that most conversations serve the ego more than they serve wisdom. Because much of what people say is not meant to connect, it's meant to impress, to manipulate, to distract. That's why, when you observe carefully, you'll notice how often people interrupt, how seldom they truly listen, and how rarely words arise from genuine compassion rather than personal gain. The Buddha taught that before speaking, one should ask three things. Is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? Most of what fills the world today fails this simple test. Gossip, criticism, idle speculation, self-promotion, endless words poured out without reflection. And this isn't harmless, because every word we speak leaves an imprint not just on others but on ourselves. Words reinforce thought patterns. They shape emotions. They weave narratives that either liberate or entangle the mind. When we constantly speak of problems, we deepen our identification with them. When we brag or complain, we strengthen pride and aversion. The ancient masters understood that careless speech creates subtle karmic ripples, both within and without. And over time, those ripples become waves, and those waves become the tides that carry our lives in directions we didn't intend. So why do most people speak too much? Because it's easier than sitting with the truth. It's easier than admitting I don't know. It's easier than facing the void inside. But silence, true, mindful silence, requires courage. It asks us to befriend discomfort, to sit with our restless mind, to confront the unspoken fears beneath our words. And in doing so, we reclaim something priceless. We reclaim presence. We reclaim the ability to listen not just to others, but to life itself. Because beneath the noise of the world, there's a current of wisdom always flowing. It whispers not in shouts, not in lectures, but in stillness. And only those who quiet their tongues and their minds can hear it. Silence. In our modern world, it often feels like an absence, an awkward space to be filled. But in the ancient Buddhist tradition, silence is not emptiness. It is presence. It is wisdom. Long before the internet, long before the noise of modern cities, the great teachers of the East understood something we've largely forgotten, that the deepest truths cannot be captured in words. They must be experienced in stillness. In the Pali Canon, one of the oldest recorded collections of the Buddha's teachings, the practice of noble silence is mentioned repeatedly. It wasn't merely a discipline for monks in retreat. It was a path to clarity, to insight, to freedom. When a disciple once asked the Buddha about metaphysical questions, is the universe eternal? Is the soul the same as the body? The Buddha remained silent. The young seeker pressed him, "Why do you not answer?" And the Buddha replied with a simple analogy. Imagine a man struck by a poisoned arrow. His friends bring a surgeon, but before allowing the arrow to be removed, he demands to know who shot it. What kind of bow was used? What feathers are on the shaft? And what poison is on the tip? He will die before his questions are answered. The lesson was profound. Some inquiries, some words are distractions. They trap the mind in endless debate, while life, like an arrow's poison, continues to work its way in. Noble silence is not the mere absence of sound. It is the choice to turn away from the unnecessary, from the speculative, from the ego-driven performance of speech. The ancient monks knew that the more one speaks, the more likely one is to stray from truth. In the Dhammapada, a revered collection of the Buddha's wisdom verses, it is said, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." This isn't mere poetry. It's a guide for how to navigate life, because speech carries power. And with power comes responsibility. The words we release can heal or harm. They can clarify or confuse. They can liberate or bind. The Buddha taught the right speech, one limb of the Noble Eightfold Path, the road to enlightenment. Right speech means speaking what is true, what is kind, what is timely, and what is necessary. And sometimes the most necessary thing is to say nothing at all. In ancient monasteries, silence was not enforced as punishment. It was offered as a precious gift. Monks would gather for silent meals, silent walks, silent meditation. Through this shared quiet, a deep connection would form, one beyond the limits of language. Because when you no longer have to explain yourself, perform, or impress, what remains is the simple, honest experience of being alive. In silence, the heart softens, the mind settles, the endless narrative dissolves, and slowly what's truly important reveals itself. There's a famous Zen koan, a kind of riddle used to awaken insight, where a student asks the master, "What is the essence of wisdom?" The master raises one finger, no words, no elaboration, just a gesture pointing towards something beyond speech. The student in that moment understood. It wasn't about collecting doctrines, reciting teachings, or debating philosophy. It was about seeing reality directly, without the filter of concepts. And to see clearly, the mind must be quiet. In our age of constant commentary, where opinions are mistaken for wisdom and loudness for authority, this ancient reverence for silence feels almost radical. But it's more needed now than ever, because it is in the quiet moments, away from screens and crowds, that we remember what it means to simply be. The Buddha often retreated into forests, caves, and solitary places, not because he despised the world, but because he understood the noise of society clouds the mind. In solitude and silence, the mind is no longer pulled by praise or blame, gain or loss, fame or obscurity. It settles. And in that stillness, insight dawns. Imagine sitting beneath a bodhi tree at dawn, the sky blushing with the first light of day, the air thick with mist. No voices, no questions, no judgments, only the pulse of your own breath, the quiet presence of ancient earth. This is where wisdom begins, and this is why the ancient Buddhist texts treasure silence not as a lack, but as a fullness too vast for words. The Dhammapada reminds us, if one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows like a shadow that never leaves. And purity of mind often begins in quiet. When you restrain careless words, when you resist the impulse to speak for attention or approval, you give space for understanding to arise. You allow wisdom to form not in the restless mind, but in the calm space beneath it. And slowly, life itself begins to whisper its secrets. Secrets only those who listen in silence will ever hear. There's a strange paradox in the human heart. We seek to be good, kind, honest, wise. Yet sometimes the very act of appearing good can lead us astray. In the ancient Buddhist tradition, this is known as one of the subtle traps of the spiritual path, flaunting one's virtue. It is the quiet poison of the ego dressed in holy robes. The Buddha understood human psychology with terrifying precision. He knew that even those walking the path of Dharma, perhaps especially those, are vulnerable to a dangerous craving. The desire to be seen as virtuous, to be admired as compassionate, to be celebrated as wise, to be known as awakened. And this craving is no different from craving wealth, power, or fame. It binds, it blinds, and it betrays the very freedom the path promises. In one ancient story, a respected monk in a faraway monastery began to notice something subtle within himself. Each time he offered alms to the poor, a flicker of pride rose in his heart. Each time villagers bowed before him, a swell of importance filled his chest. Each time he gave a sermon, he secretly hoped to be praised for his wisdom. Outwardly, he was a model of virtue. Inwardly, he was entangled. And so one night he approached his teacher and confessed, "Master, I fear my goodness has become another chain." The old monk smiled softly and spoke, "The most dangerous chains are those forged from gold." What he meant was clear. When virtue becomes a performance, it ceases to be virtue. When kindness is done for applause. When charity is offered for reputation. When wisdom is spoken to be admired. The heart remains captive. In the Dhammapada, the Buddha warns, like a beautiful flower, full of color but lacking fragrance, are the fair words of one who does not act accordingly. The true spiritual life, according to the Buddha, is inwardly simple, free from self-display. No need to flaunt goodness. No craving to be known as spiritual. No hunger for recognition. Because virtue done for its own sake leaves no trace of ego behind. Yet this trap persists, even in our modern age. In fact, it's perhaps more cunning now than ever. On social media, one can curate a persona of kindness, mindfulness, and wisdom. Photos of temple visits, captions quoting sacred texts, hashtags about peace and compassion. And yet beneath the surface, a subtle voice whispers, "Look at me. See how good I am. See how enlightened I appear." This is what ancient masters called spiritual materialism. Using spiritual practice not to dissolve the ego, but to decorate it. And like decorating a cage, it may seem more beautiful, but it remains a prison. The Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki once said, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few, because beginners are humble. They don't yet identify as wise or virtuous. They simply practice. But the moment one begins to claim spiritual titles, to see oneself as superior, or to seek admiration for one's goodness, the door quietly closes. The mind contracts, the heart hardens, and the path is lost." In Buddhist monasteries, humility was not just a virtue, it was a survival instinct. Monks were taught to guard against the smallest seeds of spiritual pride. A monk who spoke too much of his visions, his purity, his wisdom was gently reminded, "The river that is deep flows in silence," because true virtue, like deep water, makes no noise. And those who truly dwell in wisdom feel no need to announce it. Why? Because they no longer see a separate self to be admired. The ego's hunger for attention has withered. Only presence remains. The Buddha himself was known for profound humility. Even after enlightenment, when crowds gathered and kings offered riches, he remained unmoved. Not because he pretended to be humble, but because he saw through the illusion of fame and status. For him, applause and criticism were like wind through the trees. They came, they went. Neither clung to his heart. This is the freedom the Dharma promises. Not the freedom to be admired, but the freedom from needing to be admired. So let us ask ourselves in moments of generosity, of wisdom, of kindness, who is this for? Is it for the suffering beings of this world, or for the performance of our own virtue? If it's the latter, don't despair. The path is long and even the wisest stumble, but awareness is the first step. And with each moment of honest reflection, the chains loosen. Because in the end, no one can truly flaunt virtue and remain free. As the old Zen saying goes, those who know don't speak. Those who speak don't know. Or more pointedly, when the wise speak of their own wisdom, it vanishes like mist in the morning sun. So let our kindness be quiet. Let our wisdom be weightless. Let our virtue leave no footprint. And in that empty space where the need for applause once lived, something sacred will finally bloom. In the early days of Buddhist practice, many monks believed the enemy was obvious. Greed, hatred, ignorance, the classic poisons. They thought these crude forces alone blocked the way to enlightenment. But as their practice deepened, a far subtler danger revealed itself. The ego did not always appear as arrogance. Sometimes it wore the mask of humility. Sometimes it disguised itself as wisdom. Sometimes it dressed in the robes of a saint. And that, the ancient masters taught, is the hardest trap to escape. In the words of the great Tibetan teacher Chögyam Trungpa, the problem is not ego itself, but our fascination with it. Even our wish to transcend ego can become another ego trip. You see, even the desire to be spiritual, to be seen as a wise or pure person, can quietly feed the self. At first, a practitioner begins sincerely. They meditate. They chant. They study sacred texts. They start to taste peace. They feel a sense of clarity. A quiet joy arises in the heart. But then, almost imperceptibly, a voice whispers, "Look how far you've come. You're not like ordinary people anymore. You've glimpsed truths others haven't." And that ancient craving returns. The subtle ego, it no longer boasts of wealth or power. Now it boasts of virtue, of insight, of purity. In the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha warned his disciples, "Some will cling to visions, to wisdom, to meditation itself as signs of superiority. They become intoxicated with their own attainment and fall deeper into bondage. This is known as spiritual pride, and it's among the most deceptive forms of attachment. Why? Because it feels righteous. When you desire wealth or power, at least the craving is obvious. But when you desire to be seen as enlightened, to be admired as wise, to be known as humble, that craving hides within the very practices meant to free you. It camouflages itself. There's an old Zen tale about a monk who achieved profound meditative states. Visions of celestial realms appeared before him. His mind felt weightless, as if floating above the world. He rushed to tell his master. "Master," he exclaimed, "I have reached the gates of heaven." The old master looked at him with kind, weary eyes and said, "Keep going." Years later, the same monk returned, radiant, claiming he could now see through the nature of all phenomena. "I have understood emptiness itself," he declared. The master, unfazed, replied, "Keep going," and so it continued. Because the master knew what the monk had not yet realized, every claim of attainment is the ego's final stand. The subtle self will grasp at anything, visions, wisdom, meditative states, to preserve its existence. Even when stripped of worldly desires, the ego latches onto the idea of being beyond ego. And this, the masters taught, is perhaps its cleverest disguise. In modern life, the pattern repeats. You might notice it on social media, practitioners flaunting their mindfulness retreats, their fasting rituals, their silent meditations. The captions read like teachings, but the undertone whispers, "See how spiritual I am." The danger isn't in the practice itself. The danger is when the practice becomes part of an identity. When I meditate becomes, "I am a meditator." When I seek wisdom becomes, "I am wise." And when "I am humble" becomes a quiet badge of superiority. True masters, however, carry no identity. They do not label themselves wise or enlightened. They do not declare themselves humble. In fact, the deeper they go, the less they find of a self to boast of at all. In the Heart Sutra it said, "Form is emptiness and emptiness is form." There is no wisdom and no attainment. This isn't nihilism. It's a reminder that even wisdom is empty if clung to. Even virtue is bondage when claimed. And so the practice is not to destroy the ego with force, nor to pretend it doesn't exist, but to watch it patiently as it rises in new disguises, to notice the pride that follows a good deed, to sense the subtle satisfaction after a wise statement, to feel the quiet craving for spiritual recognition, and then to smile, not with judgment, but with tenderness, because to recognize the subtle ego is already to loosen its grip. As the great Zen teacher Ryokan once wrote, "In my hut this spring, there is nothing, there is everything." When the ego drops, there's no need to be admired, no need to claim wisdom, no need to declare humility. What remains is simply presence, kindness without an audience, silence without pretense, and a heart finally at peace. In a world drowning in noise, who truly listens anymore? We speak, we argue, we declare opinions with boldness, convinced our voices must be heard. In conversations, we don't really listen, we wait for our turn to respond. Even in moments of silence, our minds rehearse what we'll say next. And yet, hidden in the heart of Buddhist wisdom lies a powerful truth. Listening is not passive. It's a profound act of presence, a forgotten virtue that reveals both the world and the self. The Buddha was once asked, "How does one become wise?" He replied simply, "By listening, not merely hearing words, but by truly listening, with one's full attention, without interruption, without the need to agree or disagree, without framing a clever reply. This, the ancients taught, is a doorway to wisdom. Why is listening so rare today? Because it requires humility. To listen well, you must momentarily set aside your own ego, your opinions, your judgments, your certainties. You must become empty, open like a clear sky, receptive like still water. And the ego does not like being quiet. It craves to be heard. It rushes to correct, to instruct, to display its knowledge. It resists the vulnerability of simply receiving. In the Dhammapada it is said, "Fools speak much, the wise remain quiet, and when they speak, it is with words worth hearing." This is not because the wise lack thoughts, but because they've mastered the art of listening first. They've understood that to truly hear another is to momentarily dissolve the self. There's a Zen story of a young student who approached his master. "Master," he said, "I've come to learn the secrets of enlightenment." The master invited him for tea. As the student eagerly listed all he had read, all he believed, all his spiritual experiences, the master poured the tea. And poured until the cup overflowed. "Stop," cried the student. "Can't you see the cup is full?" The master smiled gently. "Yes," he said, "and like this cup, your mind is too full to receive anything new. First, you must empty it." Listening is the act of emptying one's cup. When you listen without the compulsion to reply, you make space for wisdom to arise. You catch the subtle truths beneath words. You begin to sense what is unsaid, the quiet emotions between syllables. In relationships, this is a rare and healing gift. Most people aren't truly seeking advice. They aren't searching for solutions. They long to be heard, to feel seen. To know their voice matters in a world where everyone shouts. And when someone genuinely listens, with stillness, presence, and compassion, a sacred space opens. Even in spiritual communities, this art is neglected. Discussions about Dharma often become debates. Practitioners subtly compete for deeper insights, for clever interpretations. But true seekers remember, it's not the loudest voice that holds the deepest wisdom, but the one most attuned to silence. In the Sutta Nipata, the Buddha teaches, "Speak only after careful reflection. Listen to the wise and you yourself become wise." Listening is itself a form of meditation. Each word becomes a moment of mindfulness. Each pause an invitation to rest in awareness. Each conversation an opportunity to witness the workings of the heart. And perhaps, in that rare silence between sentences, one glimpses something beyond words. Modern life conditions us to value speaking over listening. We measure intelligence by who speaks most confidently. We reward charisma, boldness, and rapid replies. But wisdom blooms quietly. It listens. It absorbs. It understands before it speaks. And when it finally does, its words carry weight because they arise not from compulsion, but from clarity. The great Zen master Dogen once said, "To study the way is to study the self. To study the self is to forget the self. And to forget the self is to be awakened by all things." And listening, deep, humble, present listening, is the practice of forgetting the self, not forever, but long enough to make space for another's humanity, for life's quiet wisdom, for the pulse of the moment. In that space, transformation happens. Music slowly fades. In every word we speak, there lies a seed that will take root in the hearts of others, in the unseen world, and in the deep soil of our own karma. Few realize how powerful words truly are. Spoken in anger, they can wound deeper than a blade. Spoken in kindness, they can heal what a lifetime of medicine cannot. The Buddha taught that speech is one of the most potent forces a human being can wield. And yet it is often the one we are least mindful of. There's an old teaching in the Vinaya Pitaka where the Blessed One advises, "Monks, a word well spoken is like a sweet fragrance, a soothing balm, a shade from the scorching sun. But a harsh word, a deceitful word, a word born of arrogance or cruelty, becomes a weapon, not only for the one it harms, but for the one who utters it. Why? Because words carry karma. Every sound you release into the world sets into motion a chain of unseen effects. They ripple outward into minds, hearts, families, communities, and eventually return to their source. We live in an era where words are cheap. Opinions are broadcast recklessly. Insults become entertainment. Gossip disguises itself as concern, and digital platforms have amplified this carelessness 1,000-fold. Yet the law of karma does not distinguish between a spoken insult and a typed one. Every intention behind a word leaves a trace upon the speaker's heart. In the Dhammapada, it is written, "A man is not wise because he speaks much. He who is patient, free from hatred and fear, he is truly wise." Words of anger may feel satisfying in the moment. A cutting remark might win you temporary applause, but such victories are hollow. The karma they generate, seeds of discord, bitterness, and pride, will one day bloom, and it is the speaker who must harvest them. There's a tale of a monk in ancient India who, in a moment of jealousy, spoke ill of his fellow practitioner. Though the words seemed harmless, a casual remark shared among friends, they reached the ears of many. A division arose, distrust spread. Two spiritual brothers turned into silent enemies. Years later, on his deathbed, the monk confessed his careless words. The pain of that karmic burden, heavier than the weight of his illness, had followed him like a shadow. The Buddha called this verbal karma, one of the 4 kinds of actions that shape future experiences. It is easy to overlook because it seems intangible, but words, once released, cannot be retrieved. Their echoes linger in unseen places, and in moments of solitude, they return to the speaker's mind. Speech is a mirror of the mind. What you say reveals what you cultivate within. Angry words reflect an agitated mind. Gentle words mirror a heart at peace. Dishonest words expose inner fear. The wise, therefore, guard their speech like a precious jewel. In the Sigalovada Sutta, the Buddha outlines 4 qualities of right speech: truthfulness, speak only what is true; kindness, speak only what brings benefit; gentleness, speak without harshness; timeliness, speak only at the appropriate moment. Can you imagine a world where this was the standard for every conversation, where every word was weighed before it was spoken, not out of fear, but out of compassion? Such a world would be quieter, yes, but also infinitely more beautiful. Speech is an offering. Each word you release is either a gift or a burden to those who hear it. In Buddhist tradition, monks and lay practitioners alike observe the precept of right speech, one of the factors of the Noble Eightfold Path. It's not a mere rule, but a practice of mindful awareness. Before speaking, one asks, is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? If a word does not meet these, silence is often wiser. Soft strings fade in. There's a Zen saying, "Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace." Modern life teaches us to value cleverness, sarcasm, and sharp wit, but wisdom values restraint. Not every thought deserves expression. Not every opinion requires an audience, and not every conflict needs a verbal battle. The karma of speech is subtle, but it shapes destinies. The most respected elders in Buddhist monasteries often speak the least. When they do, every syllable is like a stone dropped into a still pond. Its ripples felt long after the sound has faded. This is not because they lack opinions, but because they understand the weight of words, and so should we. For in every conversation, in every comment, in every moment of anger or affection, we are planting seeds, and one day we shall eat the fruit of what we've spoken. In a world obsessed with complexity, simplicity is an act of quiet rebellion. In Buddhist tradition, it is not the one with the most scriptures memorized, nor the one with the grandest temple, nor the one who speaks the most eloquent Dharma talks, who is nearest to awakening. It is the one whose heart is free of arrogance. The Buddha often taught in the open fields, under trees on riverbanks, or seated on simple mats made of straw. He spoke plainly, in words a farmer could grasp, a merchant could remember, and a child could feel. There is profound wisdom in this simplicity, because beneath it lies humility. Humility is not self-deprecation. It is not pretending to be small or denying your worth. It is the quiet, effortless understanding that whatever you possess, knowledge, strength, virtue, is not truly yours. It is borrowed. It is passing. It is part of the great flow of causes and conditions. In the Dhammapada it is written, like a solid rock is not shaken by the wind. So the wise are not moved by praise or blame. The one who craves applause is still imprisoned. The one who defines themselves by their virtue is still bound. True humility is like the earth. It allows all things to walk upon it, nourishes all, asks for nothing in return. In many Buddhist monasteries, new monks, no matter how wealthy, learned, or accomplished they once were, are given the humblest tasks, sweeping the floors, washing the robes of others, begging for food, not as punishment, but as a sacred training in simplicity, because it is in simplicity that pride dissolves. The ego feeds on comparisons. It thrives in hierarchies. It whispers, "You are better than them," or sometimes, "You are worse than them." But simplicity short-circuits this game. When your possessions are few, when your words are measured, when your ambitions soften, the ego starves, and in its absence, humility blooms. There's a Zen story about a renowned scholar who visited a wise monk. Eager to impress, he listed his achievements, quoted ancient texts, and explained complex philosophies. The monk quietly poured tea for him, but as the cup filled, he kept pouring. Tea spilled over onto the table, then the floor. Startled, the scholar exclaimed, "Stop, the cup is full." The monk smiled gently. "Yes," he said, "and you, like this cup, are too full to receive anything more. Only the empty cup can be filled." In Buddhist practice, simplicity isn't just about material possessions. It's simplicity of thought, simplicity of speech, simplicity of motive. Not doing less out of laziness, but choosing less because it is wise. Humility manifests in subtle ways, listening instead of interrupting, asking instead of assuming, offering instead of waiting to be asked, being content with invisibility. In fact, the most powerful acts of virtue are the ones unseen, giving in secret, helping without credit, forgiving without an audience, because when there's no one to applaud, the ego has no role to play, and what remains is pure. The Buddha was often asked, how should one live in this world of pride and greed? His answer was simple, be like the lotus. The lotus rises from the muddy waters, yet remains untouched by the dirt. It blooms in silent beauty, needing no praise. And so too, the wise practitioner cultivates simplicity and humility, not for others to admire, but because it is the nature of an awakened heart. A heart free from the burden of comparison, a mind untroubled by craving, a life rich in peace because it is uncluttered. In our modern lives, where achievement is displayed, where virtue is performed, and where complexity is mistaken for depth, choosing simplicity is a radical act. And yet it is the ancient way, the way of the sages, the way of the Buddha. May we too find beauty in simplicity, and may humility be our quiet, unwavering guide. We have journeyed through ancient wisdom, through silence, humility, and the traps of pride. But a question remains. How do we practice this here now? In the chaos of our ordinary lives, soft ambient strings rise. The Buddha never meant for his teachings to stay locked in monasteries or buried in dusty scrolls. They were meant for the streets of the city, for the fields of the farmer, for the home of the householder, for you, for me, for this very moment. And so, let us return to the ordinary and quietly transform it. Before you speak, pause, ask yourself, is what I'm about to say kind? Is it necessary? Is it true? And is it better than silence? If it's not, smile gently and let the words dissolve. In conversations, we often feel the urge to fill every silence, to prove ourselves, to correct, to impress. But notice, the wisest people you meet tend to say the least. Their words carry weight because they are rare, measured, and born from reflection, not impulse. Practice this, even for 1 hour a day. Observe how it softens your mind and sharpens your awareness. In a world of performance, on stages, on social media, in conversations, the temptation to display our virtue is constant. Look how kind I am. See how spiritual I've become. Notice how disciplined my practice is. But remember, true virtue doesn't seek an audience. Practice doing one good thing each day. Without telling anyone, give anonymously, forgive silently, help without posting it. Watch how this starves the ego, and how light your heart begins to feel. Simplicity isn't achieved in grand gestures. It's woven into the tiny decisions we make every day. Do you need to say yes to every invitation? Do you need the extra object, or is emptiness kinder? Can you leave a conversation before gossip begins? Can you choose a moment of stillness over scrolling endlessly? Each choice either feeds clutter or nurtures simplicity. Make your life spacious, not because you must renounce the world, but because your heart deserves room to breathe. In conversations, become the one who truly listens, not waiting for your turn to talk, not half-hearing while formulating a reply, but listening fully, as if each word from the other is a note in a sacred song. This simple practice dissolves ego, builds connection, and invites wisdom you might otherwise miss. Because often, it's in the spaces between others' words that the Dharma reveals itself. Anger is quick, sarcasm is easy, mockery can feel clever. But remember, words are karma. The things we say echo far beyond the moment. A careless sentence can haunt a heart for years. A cruel joke can unravel trust. So practice restraint, not out of fear, but out of compassion. Choose gentleness where harshness tempts you. Speak blessings where insults arise. And sometimes say nothing at all. Before you sleep, sit quietly. Ask yourself, when did I speak unnecessarily today? Where did I chase praise? Did I listen well? What act of quiet virtue did I offer? What can I release before tomorrow comes? This simple reflection turns daily life into a sacred path of awareness. And slowly, your ordinary moments become a field of practice. Your simple acts become a quiet rebellion against ego, noise, and vanity. The truth is, you don't need a monastery. You don't need to flee the world. The world itself is the monastery. Each conversation a sutra. Each silence a meditation. Each act of restraint a teaching. You are already on the path, and the practice begins here, in this very breath, in this humble moment. And now, we arrive at the quiet shore of our journey. We have walked through stories of silence, unraveled the traps of ego, and rediscovered the lost art of restraint. And what has all this taught us? That the world mistakes noise for power. It chases loud opinions, flashy virtue, and boastful wisdom. But the ancient sages, the awakened hearts, they all knew a secret. True strength is not loud. It does not demand attention. It does not declare itself. It resides quietly in the one who speaks less, who listens deeply, and who walks gently upon the earth without leaving scars. It is in the one who, in a world obsessed with showing, chooses instead to be. Because what you are echoes far longer than what you say. In the great stillness of a silent heart, there is a power so vast. It needs no witness. It transforms without boasting. It heals without claiming. It loves without condition. And it lets go without fear, as the Buddha taught. Better than 1,000 hollow words is one word that brings peace, and better still is the silence that carries peace. To all beings, if this message has stirred something quiet in you, if a part of you longs for a gentler, wiser way to walk through this world, I invite you to join us here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom. Subscribe if your heart feels called. Leave a comment if a thought arose, and share this with someone who walks softly yet carries the quiet strength of compassion. May your path be peaceful, may your words be few, and may your heart remain open. Until next time, be well, be still, be kind.